Imagine with me, you are a family who doesn't like to follow the rules. Your kids sleep in their clothes for the next day so that you can be ready to go storm chasing whenever it happens, usually in the middle of the night. You allow and actually encourage burping contests at the dinner table. Your 3 boys run wild around the neighborhood, doing what they want, when they want. And you're a bit of a mad scientist. And as an experiment, or maybe a ploy to get your own reality show, you create a giant balloon. A prototype, you call it. For a balloon you hope to build that allows people to hover over traffic. And one fateful day in 2009, you launched that homemade flying saucer in the air, only to realize shortly after that your 6-year-old had snuck into the balloon without you knowing. Or did you? Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Welcome back for Season 5, Cocktail Conspirators. The first few seasons were a little bumpy in terms of consistency, but this is the start of the 3rd season of me posting regularly. We have some great capers this season and some even greater cocktails, and I'm excited to share some of my favorites this season. Hey, do me a favor. Share this podcast with a friend, would you? I'm trying to increase my listener and viewership, and the best way is through word of mouth. We all know this, right? Better than a viral video, if you ask me. Well, I'd take a viral video too, actually. Anyway, like, subscribe, comment, review, and do all the things, and let's get started with Season 5. Enough of this shameless self-promoting, am I right? In 1997, Richard Heene and Mayumi Izuka met at a small acting school in Hollywood, California. Richard had moved to Southern California to chase his dream of being a comedian, and Mayumi had moved from her native Japan, where she played guitar in a rock band. They married 3 months after meeting. Richard tried his hand at acting and comedy while working as a handyman, and together they ran a small business making demo reels for actors from their home. People who knew Richard would say that he was a shameless self-promoter, kind of like me just a second ago. Anyway, for his whole life, he was a shameless self-promoter, and he would do anything to promote his latest endeavor. One thing that Richard was always into was storm chasing. Back in the 1970s, a storm ripped the roof off of a building he was working on, and that's what sparked his interest in chasing storms. He took it pretty seriously, too, riding his motorcycle into tornadoes and even flying a plane around the perimeter of Hurricane Wilma in 2005. After a move to California, Richard and Mayumi had 3 boys, Falcon, Bradford, and Ryo. The 3 grew up with their dad's adventurous spirit. Instead of normal family outings, they'd go storm chasing. In fact, when the boys were younger at least, they would sleep in their clothes for the next day in case storms were to be chased in the middle of the night. If they weren't running amok around the neighborhood, the boys were with their dad, searching for UFOs or shooting off rockets. Richard always had a knack for turning these adventures into something bigger, always ready to share their latest escapade with anyone who would listen. If Richard and Mayumi seemed made for TV, that's because, well, they were. The family actually appeared on Wife Swap twice. They were such a hit the first time that viewers demanded them back for the show's 100th episode. If you don't know the premise for the show Wife Swap, you have 2 families that are pretty much polar opposites from each other, and then the wives switch families for something like 2 weeks. The Heenes, at least the first time, swapped with an overly safety-conscious conservative family. And let me tell you, after watching that one and the other episode of Wife Swap, all I have to say is that the Heene family, particularly the parents, are completely insufferable. Even though they were considered fan favorites, I have an absolutely impossible time figuring out why. Both Richard and Mayumi spend basically the entire episode yelling in the faces of the other people, the other couple, and they absolutely pride themselves on raising sons who love to fart at the dinner table and jump off the railings. At one point, Richard creates what he calls the bitch meter for the wife he's been given in the swap, and it's so contentious that the wife that is at his house leaves to stay at a hotel. I gotta say, there is absolutely no way this man is not acting for the show. Richard, remember, had a strong desire to be famous, at least according to everyone who knew him, and he really laid it on thick for this show. He clearly wanted more than just guest appearances. After he was on Wife Swap, he pitched his vision for a show called The PSI I don't know how to say it. PScience detectives? Yeah, PSI. And I literally have no idea why. Please comment and tell me why Richard thought that this was clever or even what it stands for. He imagined this whole documentary series exploring scientific mysteries. TLC took a look at this idea for his show just months before the balloon incident happened. They passed on it though. Yes, the balloon incident. Before we hop into the Heene's version of a flying saucer, let's make a drink. Today's cocktail is called the House of Balloons. I looked and couldn't really figure out why it was called that, but here we are. This drink features aperol, which is a spirit made from a blend of bitter and sweet oranges, rhubarb, and various herbs and roots, actually, if you didn't know. The flavor is light, citrusy, and slightly herbal, and is a unique flavor that is honestly hard to replicate. Aperol was refined after 7 years of experimentation in the 19-teens by Italian brothers Luigi and Silvio Barbieri. It's been a popular Italian spirit ever since. This season, we're trying something different, and we're actually not going to make the drinks during the episode. But I would never let you down, so please don't fret. As always, the cocktails will be in the description box and the mocktail version. But if you want to talk more about the drink, hop on over to TikTok, while you still can, where the Thirsty Thursday after I post the podcast, I'll post a dedicated cocktail and mocktail TikTok with the week's drink. And don't forget, the ingredients and the recipe are in the description box. Copy pasta to your heart's content. And I'll find an alternative for TikTok if I have to. In late 2009, it was the Great Recession, and there wasn't work for Richard in remodeling. Mayumi's editing jobs had also slowed down. Richard needed a way to make some money. And he had a spark of inspiration, air balloon racing. I don't know why he thought there was a way he could make money on air balloon racing, but he did. He imagined that inventors could build their own, for lack of a better word, dirigibles, and then he could host races across the deserts of Arizona or Utah. But first, he needed to build his own balloon. They gathered together some spare cash, bought the supplies, and started building. The boys and Mayumi also helped. It was a real family affair. The balloon was 20 feet in diameter and was constructed using 16 pie-shaped plastic sheets and 2 rolls of duct tape. A circular plywood basket was attached to the bottom of the balloon with string, wood, and more duct tape. Duct tape really does solve everything, doesn't it? It rested on a wooden frame. It literally resembled a flying saucer, which I guess is what it became. They had initially scheduled the test flight for October 12th, Richard and Mayumi's 12th wedding anniversary, but there were several days of weather delays. It was a mild fall day in Fort Collins, Colorado at the Heene house on Thursday, October 15th, 2009, and the Heenes had decided that it would be the big day. Richard emptied 5 tanks of helium into the balloon, and it started to inflate, looking a lot like a Jiffy Pop on the stove. Then Richard ran 1,000,000 volts of electricity across the surface of the balloon by hooking a stun gun to the basket. The balloon was supposed to be tethered to the ground, released around 13 feet into the air, then moved using the electricity running all over the surface of the balloon. Listen, I have no idea how that was supposed to work, but apparently fringe scientist Richard did know how to do it. Unfortunately, things did not go according to plan. As their own video camera rolled on a tripod in the yard, the Heenes counted down 3, 2, 1, and then Richard pulled a release pin, releasing the balloon into the air, where it slowly floated toward the tops of the trees out back. The Heenes cheered, except there were only 4 Heenes in the backyard. 30 seconds after the balloon started floating, Mayumi and Richard realized that 6-year-old Falcon was not cheering with his brothers in the backyard. After a few frantic seconds of looking around, Bradford started screaming, "Falcon's in there! Falcon's in there!" Falcon had been playing around the balloon all morning, and now he was floating above the trees out of their yard, uncontrolled. The first thing Richard did was call the Federal Aviation Administration. He called the FAA. Richard thought they could move other air traffic out of the way and that they may be able to track the balloon on radar. The FAA said that Richard needed to call the police. But when Mayumi dialed 911, the emergency operator could not understand what she was trying to say due to both her accent and her inconsolable crying. At the same time, Richard was calling a local Denver television station because, according to him, quote, "I wanted to know if they could get a helicopter in the air and get eyes on it because no one could see what was going on," end quote. Okay, maybe. He then took the phone from Mayumi to speak with the 911 operator. And then the media circus moved in. Reporters flooded the Heene's neighborhood, and those local news stations did get eyes on the balloon with at least one helicopter following it. Fox News anchor Shepard Smith would say, quote, "We believe there is a little boy in this balloon. He can't see out and he's just flying. A 6-year-old child, a first grader," end quote. It's estimated that millions of people tuned into live national broadcasts about poor little Falcon stuck in a slow-moving, helium-filled, electrified dirigible. Gosh, I love that word, dirigible. Anyway. Meanwhile, officials arrived at the house and started searching both the Heene's home and the neighbors' houses. They also searched a wooded area nearby, a local reservoir, and a large park. Nearly an hour and a half after Mayumi's panicked 911 call, the balloon began to deflate. It slowly sank to the ground, nearly 50 miles away from the Heene home. Authorities and medical professionals rushed to the scene, surrounding the balloon and going to get Falcon out of inside. Only, one teeny tiny important detail. Falcon wasn't inside. But where was he? A deputy reported seeing an object fall out of the balloon a few miles before it landed. The Heenes and the country weren't sure if Falcon was dead or alive. According to Richard, quote, "It was the worst moment of my life," end quote. For an hour, they cried in their living room while authorities continued to search. And suddenly, Falcon appeared. The story came tumbling out. He'd been messing around the balloon's basket earlier that day, something that his dad had specifically told him not to do. Worried he'd get in trouble, he made himself scarce. While the whole world was watching that silver balloon float across the Colorado sky, Falcon was just being a kid. He'd found some toy cars up in the attic, played with them for a while, and eventually dozed off. All this chaos was unfolding, and he was just taking a nap above the garage. Phew, false alarm. All is well. Falcon is fine, no harm, no foul. End of episode, right? Sorry, not right. The thing is, it started to become clear to officials that things were a little fishy. And it's not likely they knew all about the whole wannabe famous family yelling nonstop on Wife Swap, pitching numerous shows to television network things. It all started with a CNN interview the family agreed to do the same night as the incident. What? They thought their son might be dead and then immediately wanted to be interviewed by the press and Wolf Blitzer press. I don't know. I think I would need a bit longer to recover. But then again, I've never been the most eccentric man to ever appear on Wife Swap. But they did appear on Wolf Blitzer's show on CNN, and a weird interaction went a little something like this.
Why didn't you come out?
You guys said that we did this for the show.
If you can't tell what happened, Falcon says, quote, "You guys said that, we did this for the show," end quote. Whoops. 2 days later, investigators decided they needed to talk to Richard. Then both Mayumi and Richard agreed to take a polygraph test. While those results were never released, the examiner did note in a report that Richard seemed dodgy with his answers. And then Mayumi just crumbled. She told the investigator that the entire thing was a setup. It was Richard's idea, she said, to get them attention that might get television networks to pick up the PS Science Investigators show. I still don't get it. PS. The sheriff recommended felony charges, and the family essentially went radio silent. Richard would eventually plead guilty to attempting to influence a public servant, which was a felony, while Mayumi pleaded guilty to filing a false report, which was a misdemeanor. Richard was sentenced to 90 days in jail, including 60 days of work release and 4 years probation. Mayumi was sentenced to 20 days in jail. They were also ordered to pay restitution for the costs of the emergency response and were banned from profiting from the incident for 4 years. And then, case closed. Story over, right? Come on now. This is the Heene family we're talking about. From the beginning of their dealings with law enforcement, Richard insisted that this was all a complete sham. Not the hoax, but the witch hunt after his family. He said that Mayumi was not proficient enough in English to answer the polygraph questions accurately, and that she didn't understand that she could stop the interview at any point and ask for a lawyer, which I think is a fair point. Richard tried to ask for a lawyer, but he couldn't reach anyone because it was the weekend. Mayumi claims she was threatened with deportation if she didn't admit to the hoax. The attorney they eventually hired, David Lane, would say, quote, "Every bit of what happened to the Heenes was an injustice. You're talking about tearing a loving mother from her children and her husband as some kind of revenge. It was morally repugnant for the prosecutors to put the Heenes in that position, to let this case turn into a circus. For God's sakes, it was a balloon," end quote. But there are balloons at circuses, right? They claimed their innocence from the day of the incident and beyond. After the Balloon Boy incident, the Heene family moved to Bradenton, Florida, and then to an hour and a half north of there. The boys were homeschooled because Richard and Mayumi were worried about the negative attention they might get at school. The Heene Boys, a metal band made up of Falcon, Bradford, and Ryo, Heene, wrote a song and recorded a music video in 2014. By the way, Heene Boys has a Z at the end. Ryo played the drums, Bradford guitar, and Falcon was the lead singer. Richard started marketing them as the youngest metal group in the world, and one of their songs tells their version of what happened on that fateful day in 2009. Here's the chorus for your listening and or viewing enjoyment and to hear what they say. Well, I think it's safe to say the Heene boys don't think it was a hoax. Mayumi gained her citizenship and the family moved to New Hampton, New York in 2019. But Richard still had that pesky felony conviction on his back. You see, even after all of this, Richard still had big dreams and plans. Felonies have a tendency to make those difficult, especially when one of your biggest dreams is to take your inventions to Shark Tank. You can't do that if you're a felon. Anyway, he has several inventions, but one that I enjoy the most is called the bear scratch, which is essentially a piece of wood that you can mount on the wall and scratch your back like a bear. Itchy back, dirty hands, can't reach, no problem. Scratch your back with no hands using bear scratch. Can't find your back scratcher? No problem. Bear scratch mounts on the wall, so it is always there for you. There are some testimonials on his website that include Terrell, who says, quote, "It's for my husband who is constantly scratching his back on the corners of walls, LOL," end quote. Richard was ready to find a partner on Shark Tank, saying, quote, "I know I could impress the sharks. Just give me my shot and let me do my thing," end quote. But like I said, you can't go on Shark Tank if you have a felony on your record. And lucky for Richard, Jared Polis was inaugurated the governor of Colorado in January of 2019. He pardoned both Richard and Mayumi, scrubbing the crimes from the record. Jared had this to say in a statement about the Heenes, quote, "In the case of Richard and Mayumi Heene, the Balloon Boy parents, we are all ready to move past the spectacle from a decade ago that wasted the precious time and resources of law enforcement officials and the general public. Richard and Mayumi have paid the price in the eyes of the public, served their sentence, and it's time for all of us to move on. It's time to no longer let a permanent criminal record from the Balloon Boy saga follow and drag down the parents for the rest of their lives," end quote. Their attorney would say, quote, "The balloonacy has ended," end quote. Thanks for hanging out with me. What do you think? Was it all a big misunderstanding and Falcon really was hiding in the attic where no one knew where he was? Or was he told to hide in the attic so that his family could snag an elusive television show and Richard could gain the fame he was so clearly seeking? I honestly am not sure. I think it could go either way. You tell me in the comments what you think. Next week, we're going back in history to crime-ridden gangs of New York and a character that's played a supporting role in an episode last season, but gets her moment in the full spotlight with an episode of her own. Marm Mandelbaum, the queen of fences herself. The ingredients for next week's cocktail and mocktail are in the description box, so pick them up this week, and I'll see you next week. Remember, there are always alternatives to sticking your 6-year-old son in a balloon for the clout.